Welcome. Can you hear me okay? I'm Sarah Hess. I'm a staff attorney at Legal Counsel for Health Justice. We're talking today about trauma-informed advocacy. This has really been a passion project of mine and Amanda's since law school, really, thinking about the ways that we provide legal services and the ways that we can be therapeutic in that provision. And so we're going to talk about this today. We are not neuroscientists. We are not therapists, although she's credentialed, actually. We should talk about that. Yeah. But we do want to give you a jumping off point, so we're going to give you some of the science and mostly focus, though, on practical tools on how to provide legal aid. Oh, sure. Yeah. So I am a staff attorney on a medical legal partnership. Previously, we were working with a care coordination program, so we were working with community health workers who were doing home visiting for kids with chronic illness. We were also trying to give those community health workers some of these tools. But the idea is to provide direct legal services to kids with chronic health issues, and then also to upstream some policy improvements from there.
Yes. And like Sarah said, my name is Amanda Walsh. I'm also a staff attorney with Legal Counsel. I do have a law and social work degree, which is really where my passion for this topic kind of stemmed, was through the social work training and using those skills to inform how I provide legal services to clients. I work also on an MLP project. I partner with a children's mental health clinic at Mount Sinai Hospital, so providing legal services, mostly special education, public benefits, some immigration, emergency planning services to kids and families mostly living on the south and west sides of Chicago.
All right, so pretty brief agenda. We're going to talk about the overview of trauma. We're talking about the neuroscience behind it, symptoms that you may be recognizing in your clients, ideas of resilience, and then the meat of the topic is really the practical tools. How do you adapt this information into your practice, both in terms of your provision of legal services, but also in thinking about how we, as folks in the helping professions, are impacted by this kind of work, and ideas for sustainability for all of us. So I recently had a client. She was 10 years old. She had a serious developmental delay. And she also had a mom who had a pretty low functional capacity. As we were working together, trying to get her kid special education services, every time something went wrong, not something on our end, but like the school bus didn't show up or it showed up late, mom would become entirely explosive. She'd start yelling at me, screaming at me. She'd usually hang up on me, and then she would fire me by text message. And then 10 minutes later, she would say, the school called and asked about this, I need your help. So as I was working with this client, I'm thinking, what is causing her to have this reaction rather than what is wrong with her? And that's really at the heart of these trauma-informed practices. Not what's wrong with you, but what has happened to you. And it still took a lot of patience and sort of self-reflection on my part to work with her. But I really believe that in the end, we were able to get really fantastic special ed services for her child, specifically because when she fired me, I didn't immediately take that as an opportunity to close her case. Right? I recognized that that was an action, a behavior that was stemming from something else going on in her life, or maybe her history. And sure enough, she turned around and would ask for help. And I felt like, even though it was a really difficult relationship, every time she texted me back and asked for help, I felt like I'm winning, right? Like, this is going really well. She knows that even after she's had an explosive moment with me, that I'm a safe person for her to come back to. And I think that's not been her experience in most of the systems that she has encountered. So the reason we're talking about this today is because we think that, and we've seen in our own practices, that applying these principles to your practice really improves the practice itself. I think we were able to achieve something for that child rather than closing her case early, specifically because of these practices.
And we'll talk about this more once we go through some of the neuroscience and how trauma actually impacts your clients and how they present to you. but also how trauma plays into your legal practice. So for me, with a lot of the kids, particularly the kids I work with, they have a pretty severe trauma history. So one client that I always was having to remind myself to go back to this, the science of trauma, to understand how the client was interacting with me, how they were reacting to what we were trying to do for them. It was a 17-year-old boy who had been the victim of multiple drive-by shootings over a year period, 3 times. He'd lost friends in those. And whenever he and his therapist would schedule an appointment to meet with me, it was always the one time he never would show up to the therapy. He was very consistent with his therapy, but if he knew he was meeting with me, he wouldn't show up. When we finally were able to meet, he was very withdrawn. He didn't want to talk to me. He didn't want to talk about what was going on. He was very happy to talk to the therapist about his goals, and we were working on education issues. The school had kicked him out and had not helped him at all address his both his physical, the symptoms he had from the physical injuries, but also his emotional health. But really having for me to really understand why he was communicating with me the way he was, or lack thereof, and not with a therapist. So his example always comes out for me, both as how he's talking to me, but also how the trauma in his life directly changed my legal strategy in his case as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well.
And so I hope you're gathering the overall reason for this training is really that when helpers are interacting with kids and adults, it's meant to help you see their behavior as part of the context of trauma in their lives, so that also we have more resilience in dealing with those challenging behaviors and providing these services. And all of that is because humans are relational, right? We have to have human relationships to feel regulated, to feel safe, to be stable. But trauma disrupts those relationships, and then the behaviors that flow from traumatic experience or toxic stress really influence the way that you interact with other people. So as we provide legal services, we are a relationship, right? We're in a relationship with our clients, and we're providing a relational sense of emboldening and empowering our clients that really makes a difference. So always good to start with a definition. There are a lot of definitions about trauma that are out there floating around, but I really like this one because it gets to the essence of trauma, in that you can experience a traumatic event without being traumatized, right? So something that threatens or harms the physical or emotional integrity of an individual or someone close to them, that also overwhelms the ability to respond, and that results in adaptations that create significant difficulty in functioning. So I've been in a couple car accidents in my life. They were probably traumatic at the time that they happened. They were traumatic at the time that they happened. Now I'm thinking about it. But I don't think about that every time I get in a car, right? It hasn't adapted my behavior to avoiding cars or taking buses instead. So you can have a traumatic event without being traumatized, and that's an important basis for all of this work.
So it's also important, though, as we go through this, to think about how trauma impacts us in our practice. So especially in legal aid, we're in particular often working with communities that have faced high rates of trauma. In fact, I was looking at the Sinai Urban Health Institute did a community health needs assessment of neighborhoods throughout the city, and they found that community members actively had symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder as high as 29% of the population of those communities. So we know in our practice as legal aid practitioners that the populations we're working with have likely experienced trauma or know people who've experienced trauma. And that takes a toll on us hearing their traumas, having to adapt around their traumas, having to adapt our behavior around their behaviors. It can take a big toll on us. So you've probably heard the terms vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, when you're internalizing the traumas that you're hearing about. I think a newer term that's being used is empathic distress, which I really love, the idea of taking on another's distress. So you can have you can have empathy, but when that empathy goes too far, when you start having negative reactions to the things you're hearing about, then you're probably at a point where you have empathic distress. Some of you in the room might be feeling empathic distress now. You might have hit a point where it's too, you've heard so many horror stories from your clients' experiences that it's just too much. And, I've experienced that in my practice. I've had points where I just hit, almost a burnout level where it felt like I just couldn't possibly have the patience anymore to deal with this client, or the whoever I was working with alongside the client. So it's important to note that too, that we're not just talking about trauma advocacy around our clients, but also how it's impacting us in our practice. And we'll talk more about tips on how to combat that.
So, of course, there's tolerable stress, there's good stress, and there's stress that doesn't have a negative impact on us, and that's not what we're talking about today. So positive stress, so like standing in front of this room of illustrious legal aid attorneys, my heart rate probably rose at the beginning of the presentation, my pupils are probably dilated. All of that is to help me survive this experience, but it's a good thing because it's also helping me think more clearly, it's helping me stay on task, on focus, and it's not having a negative impact on me in the long haul. Some people may not feel the same way. But tolerable stress is yet another level, right? So the loss of a family member, when you have a strong family network around you, that's a deep stress, but it's also tolerable because you have these other supportive factors. Also not what we're talking about today. What we are going to talk about, though, is toxic stress, which sometimes is used as a placeholder for trauma. They're really different concepts, but the tenets of both are going to flow through this presentation and I think the way we provide services. So toxic stress is a prolonged activation of a stress response system in the absence of protective relationships. So earlier when I was saying that we're all relational by being human, it's directly tied to how you experience stress. When you have protective relationships around you, you have a different experience of stress. I'm probably less stressed because I have my friend with me for this presentation. So thinking about that when you work with clients, every story you hear is not necessarily going to have traumatized them or to become something to the level of toxic stress. So all of this science really comes out of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. Is anyone familiar with the ACEs study? Good, yeah, it's definitely gaining popularity. So it was a study from the late 1990s, early 2000s by Drs. Felitti and Anda. It was a Kaiser Permanente study in California. 17,000 respondents, mostly adults, were surveyed about their adverse childhood experiences. And it came out of actually an obesity study that one of the doctors was involved in, and he had been asking his patients very detailed patient histories. And in one of his visits, the study was focused on obesity. And so some of the patients in the study were having great success, others weren't. Some were having great success followed by a total regain of the weight. And they were trying to figure out why. So they were doing these very detailed patient histories, and he was asking one of his patients, the typical question was, when did you become sexually active? And he slipped, and he asked her, when was your first sexual experience? And she said, I was 4, it was my dad. And it was this light bulb moment for him, and so that's the inception of the ACEs study, was to try to figure out if there was a correlation between those two ideas. And so in an effort to keep it a controlled study, they looked at just events that happen in the home that would impact children. So I don't know if you can read the chart, but it's 10 categories: physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, different kinds of neglect, physical and emotional neglect, and then what we are trying to get people to call household challenges rather than dysfunction, which has a judgmental tone to it. But we're thinking about mental illness in the home, having an incarcerated family member, a mother treated violently, divorce in the home, and then substance use or substance challenges in the home. And so what they found through this study was that there is a dose response. There's a direct correlation between the number of ACEs that a child has experienced and negative health outcomes. So the higher the number of your ACE score on a scale of 1 to 10, the higher the likelihood, the higher the risk of negative adult health outcomes. And so they found a strong correlation there, going not only from negative health outcomes to also risky behaviors, mental and emotional health, and Amanda will talk about that. Sorry, I started to.
No problem. Yeah, so that's what was truly stunning from the study is when they connected that these childhood experiences, the various forms, these different kinds of trauma that the child had experienced, actually had correlations with negative health outcomes. So much higher risk of risky behaviors like smoking, heavy drinking, obesity, higher incidences of actual diseases, cardiovascular, diabetes, asthma, and then higher incidence of poor mental health too as an adult. So we're talking, years after the child had experienced some of these traumas. And what's really interesting about the study, the original ACE study though, is that it was solely geared towards middle class insured adults who were in the study. So they weren't even looking at low income children, minority children who might be experiencing similar experiences. So since the original ACE study, there have been dozens of studies replicating the results and expanding the definition of ACEs to also look at other types of trauma that aren't just in the home, so community trauma, violence in the community. And what the further science has shown is that not only do these individualized experiences of youth of a child impact their overall outcomes as they go throughout the lifespan, but also adverse community events. So experiencing poverty or community violence also shows the same correlations to negative outcomes, but also historical trauma. And I find I'm particularly interested in this right now. I think it's really fascinating, the study of epigenetics and how looking at the actual science of how when you experience a trauma, your genes can actually be altered, and then you can pass on your altered genes to your children. So there was a really interesting study in mice where they had adult mice that they trained to fear the smell of cherry blossoms by lightly shocking their feet when they would smell it. They then had them reproduce, and they had mice pups who had never smelled cherry blossoms, but when they did, they had the exact same fear reaction that their parents had. So they were able to, in the study, show that the mouse's mind was actually changed, and their genes were actually changed to have the exact same reactions and physiological responses to the smell of cherry blossoms that their adults do. So they're showing the science is growing every day and showing the same thing with other types with traumas in adult and humans as well, and how. So we're not just talking about what something a child experienced in their home, we're talking about generations of trauma too that could be impacting them.
So it's important to remember in light of all of that kind of doom and gloom that this is about risk factors, right? So this is not predictive of people. It doesn't mean that because someone's parent had a traumatic experience that the child is going to have these reactions or is going to have a similar set of behaviors. It's about risk factors, and the thing that's really significant about that is that there are a lot of protective factors. So the same way that someone may lose a family member and experience it as a traumatic event, when they have a strong family network around them, they have protective factors that can really forestall or change their experience, forestall the traumatic symptoms that can flow from it. So the science behind this is pretty complicated, and we don't need to go into it. So this is as science-y as we will get today. This is an image that was created by the Illinois Adverse Childhood Experiences Response Collaborative. We're going to change our name, so don't worry about that. But a bunch of physicians on the collaborative came together and said, all the neuroscience is too much for people who are not neuroscientists. And they distilled all of the literature and research. They've started a new research arm at the University of Illinois Chicago that's doing fantastic work. It's called THEN, T-H-E-N, if you're interested. But they distilled all of that research down to these sort of basic tenets. So you can see at the bottom is the red brainstem. In the middle is the emotional state, which is also what controls your limbic system, which we'll talk about. And then in the front, the green chunk is the cortex. So you may hear people talking about his prefrontal cortex isn't developed yet. That's what they're talking about, the green section. So the red section is really what we are at our very most basic. It's evolutionarily the oldest part of our brains, but it's also the oldest part of your brain. It's the first part of your brain that forms in the womb. So it's also very powerful. If the brainstem, if the red part of your brain is telling your body what's going to happen and what you're going to do, you're going to do it. You're not going to debate it. You're not going to have time to think about that. The blue section is really what's going to regulate your body systems, or the ANS, the Autonomic Nervous System. So the blue section is what's interpreting what happened in the red section and then telling the rest of the body how to react. So when I mentioned earlier that my heart rate is probably elevated, my pupils are slightly dilated, that's the blue chunk telling my body that it's going to operate that way. And then finally, the green portion, the cortex, is asking what it all means, right? This is where your executive functioning is handled. It's the part of your brain that makes meaning from all of these other things that are happening. So some of the, we're not going to go too deeply into the science, but I wanted to give you some examples of how the brain operates during a traumatic event and what that can mean for the person experiencing it. So for example, I'm sure you've heard the term fight or flight. Often it's actually fight, flight, or freeze. And that's the red part of the brain determining what's going to happen. So you see, well, let's say you smell smoke, right? And the red part of your brain, if that's a triggering experience for you, is going to say fire, you're going to start running, your heart rate is going to elevate so that you can pump blood faster and get away. The blue part of your brain is going to tell all of those body systems how to handle that and what they need to do. But then it's the green part that can say, that's a bonfire and I'm going to have dinner soon, instead of this is a fearful moment and I need to protect myself. So it's really about which part of your brain is dictating the behavior, more than trying to convince yourself one thing or another. It's more like who's in charge. So I wanted to just give you some examples. One thing that happens in a traumatic experience is often it activates the right brain and to some degree shuts down the left brain. So the right brain is intuitive, it's emotional, it's visual, it's spatial, right? All of the things that you would need in order to outmaneuver a bear or get away from the fire. Whereas the left is linguistic, it's sequential, and it's analytical. So you think about a client telling you a story and coming to a really traumatic part of the story and maybe not having the words to describe what happened. And that's because the language center is left brain and often is literally shut down during a traumatic experience. So the part of the brain that would be active in order to create words to put to an experience wasn't functioning for many people at the time of their traumatic experience. So they literally can't come up with the words. Being sequential about things, right? It's not important when you're running from a bear to figure out the order of when you saw the bear, when you turned, when you ran. You just run. And so that part of the brain is not useful for survival at that moment, and so then it's also not activated when someone is retelling you the story later, right? They may have trouble with sequence. We heard a lot of criticism about Dr. Blasey Ford in her testimony because initially she couldn't remember some of the things in order or she couldn't remember particular details. Those parts of her brain were very likely not working in the same way that they are in her daily professional life where she's clearly brilliant. That's an aside. So So another example, so speech. There's an area called Broca's region, or Broca's area, which is the left frontal lobe, so green area, which gets entirely shut down, so that's the lingual portion I mentioned. The visual area, Brodmann's area, lights up when people are reliving trauma or when they're experiencing trauma, because it's extremely important that you can see what's happening during a traumatic experience. But the difference is that normally what happens is when we see something, we take it in, and then it is eventually moved to a different section of the brain for storage, for meaning making. What happens when someone's experiencing something extremely traumatic is those visual images may never leave that area. And so when someone relives a traumatic experience, it is literally like reliving it, because they are literally experiencing those visuals again in many cases. Of course, this isn't true of every single person. Everybody has different experiences. But it's something that we should be looking out for and careful about as we ask people about their experiences, right? Something that we should be on alert for as we have these conversations. Of course, smells and sounds can do the same, can have the same triggering effect. A final piece, so the timekeeping section of your brain is often shut down, so it's difficult to mark time. And so if someone is reliving a traumatic experience, it can be very hard to get them to calm down, right? So like we do a lot of special education work. If a child is re-traumatized in the moment, trying to get him to calm down is going to be really difficult, partly because he has no marker of time in certain circumstances, and so it literally will feel like this is never ending, it has never ended, and it will continue forever. So another thing to think about as we talk through these stories with clients. So all of this, again, it can sound kind of doom and gloom, but the brain forms in a use-dependent manner. And that's partly why it's important to us, because when kids have experienced this, it will shape their interpretations and adult behavior. But it also means that our brains are neuroplastic, like our brains are flexible and can continue to be formed and changed. So even though someone has had a single experience, it doesn't mean that they can't also alter the way that they interpret those experiences going forward. So this is an example of the ANS, the autonomic nervous system. This is, again, the blue part of the brain, the limbic system. And essentially it's showing the different bodily systems that are impacted when that blue chunk of your brain is activated and telling your body what to do. And this is really important to us at Legal Counsel for Health Justice, because we're so focused on health issues, in understanding that when someone is exposed to toxic stress, right, the repeated experience of stress that they can't handle, it's constantly impacting so many different systems. And now there have been a lot of studies that are more closely linking these different conditions or chronic illness. So there have been some studies that link traumatic experience in childhood to childhood diabetes, both type 1 and type 2. There's lots of different studies that are kind of demonstrating all the different ways that the physical self in reacting to stress is actually having a significant effect on your bodily function. And when those functions are constantly doing something extra or more, or there are more hormones coursing through the body in order for these systems to operate, that's going to have a long-term impact on your health. So an easy way to think of it is that when the rational brain, when the green executive functioning part of the brain and the emotional brain are working together, the red and blue, everything is in harmony, right? You can control your emotions, you can control your behaviors. But what we see with kids a lot, and also adults, is that when the emotional brain takes charge, the rational brain can't change anything that's about to happen, at least not without different kinds of resources and support. When your limbic system has decided it's life or death, that is the prevailing thought that's happening. In fact, it's not a lot of thought. And because that has become so strong, that actual connection to the green portion of the brain is very tenuous. It's already weakened. And so when you try to calm down a kid and say, calm down, you're okay, the rational part of their brain is like not there to tell them, yeah, I am okay. And so when you think about, like, when we think about special education planning, for instance, we really want to make sure that teachers are taking a different approach to that, which we'll talk about briefly.
So all of that trauma science, really, for us, what's really important to know is how it's actually going to impact how your clients present and how they behave, either with you or generally. So for adults, you see a lot of anger or depression. A lot of adults experience unexplained physical pain. So one of our colleagues, a lot of her clients has a lot of psychosomatic pain that can't be explained from medical issues. But they have severe trauma histories that we're looking at. And oftentimes, as a way to cope with this pain that's unexplained, is through substance use as a way to medicate, to kind of dilute that pain as much as possible. And a coping mechanism that's effective in the moment, but might not, be the best in terms of overall functioning. You see a lot of high risk and impulse behaviors, an inability to de-escalate. So if they're triggered, so like Sarah's example of her client, of the mom who would get very upset and get to, she wasn't able to de-escalate in that time, but in 10 minutes later or whenever it was that she was able to text Sarah, hey, I actually do need your help. She was able to calm down, but not very quickly. Also already mentioned substance use, alcohol use, a lot of also aggression and self-harm you might see in your adult clients, or also just alienation and social withdrawal. So one of my clients, for example, constantly, or one of my clients' moms, whenever I talk to her, whenever she calls me to talk about something, it's always, I am so sorry to bother you. I'm trying not to call you again. I'll try not to bother you. Like, she sees herself as such a burden on my schedule, and I have to constantly remind her that, no, like, it's totally, like, please call me. It's fine. But having to try and remind her of that to keep her from withdrawing, because she keeps trying to withdraw when we're interacting. So what all this means is it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean your brain is broken. Sarah already kind of talked about this. It's very adaptive. So there's treatments that we'll talk about, but also in how we interact that can help address some of the adaptive behavior as well.
So in kids, it can look a little different. We hear a lot about children who have a really difficult time soothing, particularly self-soothing, but even to be soothed by someone else. They're chronically aroused. They're always ready to be attacked. They're always ready to defend against the thing that has shaped their behavior. A lot of unspecific or non-specific generalized fears. A sense of foreshortened future, like, why are we even doing this? It doesn't matter, is something we hear with some of our teen clients. Difficulty forming peer relationships. This is something that teachers will comment on. You can actually get information about this. Do they have friendships at school? A trauma-informed teacher is going to help a child build those relationships, right? Because again, we are relational. The biggest cure for all of this is stable relationships. Also impulsive behavior, just like adults, inability to recognize danger or consequences. We got a referral for a kid who is 8 years old and just constantly running into traffic, like running into big busy streets. And then stranger anxiety or indiscriminate attachment. So I was working at a school-based health center and had this 3-year-old just latch onto me like a little koala. But she didn't know me, she'd never seen me before, I didn't look like other people in her life. And it was an inappropriate attachment, right, in that scenario. The point of these is not for us to be diagnosing these, right? It's not for us to say, oh, this little kid latched onto my leg and definitely has a trauma history. That is not the point of this, right? But the point is for us to give some context to behaviors that may otherwise be difficult in our clients and make it difficult for us to serve them.
Yeah. So as we kind of discussed in the beginning, it's also, again, for us important to understand this because it does impact you also on a daily basis. So, through burnout, where you're experiencing physical or mental collapse from overwork or compassion fatigue or empathic distress, you can also call it, the decreasing ability to be concerned with the plight of others because of repeated exposure to it. So the exact same list from what you saw from how adults might be, the behaviors they might be exhibiting after experiencing trauma or having a trauma history might be the exact same symptoms that you are suddenly explaining. So you might be more angry or depressed or have unexplained physical pain, inability to de-escalate as well, withdrawal, something. I think that happens a lot, especially in this work, is withdrawal in terms of withdrawing from clients. So not wanting to, being resistant to following up or, being okay. It's easy when the client fires you in a second, and it's easy to say, like, okay, I can get that one off my list instead of, trying to stay engaged with the client as well. So you'll see similar symptoms. Sure. But again, it's not all bad news. So there's a lot of a lot of science around resilience. So resilience is the ability to recover and show early and effective adaptation following a potential traumatic event. Not everyone exposed to adverse experiences will be traumatized. There's a lot of science that has shown what factors really help increase resilience for kids and adults. So one of the most critical for kids is having just one positive, consistent adult relationship in their life, just one. That's all it can take to completely help really build their resilience and go reverse the effects of some of the trauma they've experienced. And same as adults, you have the ability to constantly learn and change, and our brains can adapt. So it's, again, why it's also important for us as professionals working directly with the populations to try and adapt our behavior to help that along as much as we can.
So again, we're not trying to be therapists, but we did want to give you just some idea of the kinds of support that's out there for this particular issue. So one of the things, though, that's really important is meeting basic needs. So allaying survival fears, so making sure that people feel safe in their environment, but also sleep and food and, right, like, I mean, we often have clients whose SNAP has been cut off and the family is having trouble eating regularly, right, or grandma's not eating so that the kids are. That's going to build a situation that's going to be very hard for a family to be resilient. I had a client recently where the sleep hygiene in the family just wasn't something that they had really ever thought about. And her kid has type 1 diabetes, so we were talking about some of the challenges in getting him to eat regularly. And in the food conversation, it came out that they're all up like all night at different points, and so there's all these opportunities for him to eat. And so we started talking about sleep, and it was something that the mom had just not heard about. It just wasn't a discussion. It didn't come up with her doctor. And we started talking about good sleep practices, which is just, it's not lawyering, right? But I have personal experience with it because this work is stressful. And she was able to instill some of these practices, and now this kid sleeps through the whole night and doesn't have an extra, set of carbs in the middle of the night. So sometimes having these conversations with clients is going to bring up stuff that we're not expert in, and my point is not that you should advise people on sleep hygiene, but to recognize that there are so many different factors that are going to deplete people's resources in dealing with a traumatic history, or dealing just with the difficulty of all the systems that we all are working in that they are forced to encounter. So there's also a lot of interesting brain work. There's bottom-up and top-down brain work, which is so like you can regulate when the red brainstem section is dictating what's happening. You can start by breathing and slowing down the limbic system and the autonomic nervous system then can translate to the other parts of the brain that things are okay. So there's some interesting work with that. Here's the foundational health practices. Cultivating self-awareness. There's actually a lot of good science these days on the importance of mindfulness and meditation in helping people to self-soothe and helping people to at least start with a better baseline in the morning, for instance. And then making meaning and integrating the brain. So there's been some great work done with veterans who have PTSD, who have tried like all of the treatment and all of the medications and really had no success. And someone put together a 12-week course on trauma for veterans to understand their own trauma. And that process of making meaning was really successful in helping people control their impulses or to recognize that when they were becoming triggered that they needed to engage in their breathing exercises or to put themselves in a safer space. And there have been a bunch of different communities around the country that have adopted that making meaning kind of process and had great success. And then, of course, there's a lot of different therapeutic techniques that you can get. So, finally, the meat of the presentation. Again, what we're doing here is saying that you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic, right? We can provide services in a manner that is not going to further harm our clients. That does not mean that we're trying to be therapists. It doesn't mean we're trying to take on issues that we are not qualified to handle. And so there are some core principles and ways to do that. So just to give you a sense, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, has come up with a sort of codified set of principles around this and practices. And what it really comes down to is, first off, as an organization, recognizing the widespread impact of trauma and understanding potential paths for recovery. Recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, ourselves, and others involved with the system. Right? If you've ever been to DHS, this could be helpful to you in working with caseworkers. An organization should respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. So there are a lot of different ways that we run our organizations that could be just slightly tweaked or shaped or reframed to do the same thing, but to have an effect that is less traumatic or that avoids re-traumatization. And that's really, the fourth piece is really the main point, I think, in providing legal services is, again, we're not trying to be therapists, but we are trying to make sure that as we provide services, we are not re-traumatizing our clients. We're setting them up for as much success as possible. All right.
So I think it's also important to note when we think about trauma is where it is in our practice. So something in our conversations, I really enjoy our conversations about when we're thinking about trauma-informed advocacy in our day-to-day work. So our aim, as Sarah just said, is always to mitigate the consequences and avoid re-traumatization. But in your practice, identifying where the trauma is in your practice is going to be really critical. So it might not be central to your work. And so you shouldn't uncover it. You shouldn't sit down and do an ACE questionnaire and get ACE scores of your clients. But you might, through your work, hear about some of the trauma, and you can start to put pieces together and realize that this client might be experiencing a trauma history, and it might explain some of their behaviors. And other instances, it might be at the heart of your advocacy. So for a lot of our clients and a lot of like the kids that we work with, the trauma is directly directly central to our legal strategy in the case. So that can be sometimes more of a balancing act, is because you need to know the trauma, you need to understand the trauma that the child might have experienced or that the family's experienced, but trying to make sure that you remain supportive, that you also understand, they might be very resistant to telling you the whole story at first, or they might not tell you the truth, they might change the facts, it could be very difficult for them to share that story. So wanting to integrate your understanding of how the trauma might be impacting them in retelling it while you're trying to engage in your legal strategy with them. I think in legal aid, in some ways, we're a little unique because we might have a little more flexibility. I mean, we're trying to serve a lot of clients, and there's definitely not enough of us out there, but we have a little more flexibility in how we can provide legal services. You might not have as strict of like quotas of client numbers that you're trying to reach, so you can have a little more time in trying to integrate, being a little more patient, or instead of, 2 no-shows, that's it, they're done, I'm kicking them off my caseload, having a little more of that flexibility. I think we're a little more uniquely positioned to be able to do that when we work with our clients.
So once you've figured out where the trauma is in your practice, is it central? Do you have to know about it? Do you need to uncover it? Versus, can you just provide trauma-informed lawyering in a way that's not going to re-traumatize? Once you've figured that out, then there are 5 sort of main areas that you can work in to improve your services. So establishing safety is the first and most important. So you can consider your physical environment, the position of seating. Some people are going to want to be, in a corner with walls on both sides behind them so that they know no one is coming at them from a place they can't see. Other clients are going to want to sit right next to the door so that they can get out if they need to. These are also not things that your client is probably going to be really conscious of, but providing choice as you do that, which is another tenet we'll talk about, can go a long way. We've really tailored the environment at Legal Counsel to be as trauma-informed as possible. So we have 2 client interview rooms at the front of our space in the reception area. We've got nice lighting. It doesn't look like a clinical exam room, which is where most of our clients are spending a lot of time, is in hospitals and doctors' offices. So there's like shelves on the walls and, brightly colored paintings and low lighting and comfortable seating. Those kinds of things can actually go a long way. Really important is being non-judgmental, and I think it comes down to that central question again at the beginning, which is not what's wrong with you, but what has happened to you. Reframing the way that you think about your clients. Do you want to say?
Yeah, I was just saying, this actually just came up. I was at the clinic and overheard a conversation, and I immediately thought it was like, oh, if they were trauma informed, that would have handled differently. And it wasn't the clinicians; it was to a couple people in the waiting room. But I overheard someone say to, and I'm assuming it's like a teenager, but I assume the teenager to the mom, like, why are you in such a bad mood? And I immediately thought, like, maybe the better way to have asked that is what's happened that's caused you to feel this way right now, right? So, like, being able to think, like, differently than that. And so instead of mom then becoming very angry and upset, like, what do you mean I'm in a bad mood? Trying to be non-judgmental does actually uncover what's going on.
And I think that's a good one for how we ask our questions in intake interviews or when we're sitting with our clients. So instead of like, why didn't you take Jimmy to school? Did something happen that made it hard to get Jimmy to school, right? So, law school beats the passive voice out of you, but now I think this is a great time for you to bring it back. Because it leaves everything open-ended. It removes the judgment from your question, and it lets the person answer your question in the way that they actually want to, as opposed to the leading question. Continued assurances. So I have teenagers who are have clearly been through a lot. And I will actually give them a text message, just shoot them a text every time that I'm going to call and talk to their therapist, right? We already signed a release of information at the beginning. They know that I'm going to work with their therapist, but it's going to give them a sense of safety and assurance that they know when I'm having those conversations. And then always, security for staff, I think, is another one that can be helpful. What do you do for your own safety, right, in order to feel safe in providing these services? Do you have like a Skype chat system set up in each of the client rooms so that if anything starts to get difficult, you can immediately, start typing to someone without having to get up or, changing sort of the dynamic of the situation? That's another place for all of you to think about where are the moments that you can create more safety for your staff. And then previewing what will come, right? So we started with an agenda. We wanted you to know what was coming. We actually do this on lots of phone calls with clients. When I have a client phone call, I call and I say, hey, we need to talk about these 3 things. I like preview what's coming, long-term previewing, like I know that this was a traumatic experience and we don't have to talk about it today. I would like to talk to you about it next week though, right? So letting people know what to expect can go a long way in helping them feel safe. Someone asked me the last time I gave this presentation, like what do I do when I'm just the intake line person and I don't know who's calling and I don't know their story and I have to ask them about things that may have been a trauma or a traumatic experience. And I think when you pick up that phone as an intake specialist, explaining why you're asking questions, explaining why this process is the way it is, can really help people feel safer.
And so for many people who have a trauma history, they're going to always wonder if they can trust you. And so that's the second big tenet, is to really be trustworthy. So being really predictable and consistent, and establishing really clear boundaries. And this can be really hard in our daily practice, so you will probably fail at it. So I've had multiple occasions where I've promised a client, like, I will get to you by the end of the day. But other client emergencies came up or something happened and I didn't get to them by the end of the day. So the next morning, having a conversation with them, acknowledging, like, I promised I would call you by the end of the day and I didn't do so and I'm sorry. And then that's okay. It is okay to acknowledge, and really good to acknowledge your clients when you have failed, if you did break a promise that you gave. It helps improve that trusting relationship. Being really transparent about the process and expectations about communication. So these are really important conversations that we have in the beginning of, both right at the beginning when we're starting and to build that relationship with the client, and then ongoing. Explaining, so one of the things that I have to explain a lot to clients is, we will have to request school records first to be able to figure out what's going on and how we might be able to assist you, and then reminding them that, like, you might not hear from me in 2 weeks, or you might not hear from me for a month, or however long I expect it might take to get the records. And then in 2 weeks, when they call and they're upset because I haven't talked to them in 2 weeks, saying, you're right, we haven't been able to speak, but, do you remember when we talked about the records? I promise I will follow up. So having those consistent conversations, and reminding them those expectations, but also setting up the expectations for you too. You probably will not be able to reach me after, not probably, you shouldn't be able to reach me after 6 p.m. or whatever the check-off deadline is for you. Not sugarcoating situations. So never listening to a client talk about a bad experience they had and saying, well, at least you have this going for you or something. That's terrible. We don't want to say that. We don't want to sugarcoat we don't know their experience. We can't imagine what they've experienced. And then, like I said, keeping promises and not over-promising. And that's a skill. And like I said, I've broken that multiple times with clients and have to really learn how to learn and adapt my legal practice into making sure I understand what I can promise, particularly if it's communications and deadlines, like when I will call or be able to follow up with you or not. And learning as you go, how to be able to make those, make sure that you're you're not over-promising.
So providing choice is another way that you can make clients feel safe, but also empowered. Oftentimes when someone has experienced something traumatic, it was because they were completely out of control, right? Something was happening to them. And so trying to provide some autonomy and choice can go a long way. It also goes a long way in building the relationship with your client, which goes to the trustworthiness slide as well. So I mentioned earlier that when I call clients, I always give them a roadmap of what we need to talk about. Then I give them the choice about which thing they would like to talk about first. It's like the smallest thing, right? And sometimes they're annoyed and they're like, just pick. But it's a moment where you can say, like, you are as much a part of this as I am, and I'm going to follow your lead on some of these things. Laying out different paths to get to the same goal. I think sometimes we get really prescriptive in the legal profession. We say this is what you should do and this is how to do it. But in legal aid, we really need to be a little bit more flexible and think about what really is going to achieve your client's goal outside of what your professional recommendation might be. Never saying you have to. So I used to overhear this a lot with community health workers who really wanted people to avoid some kind of problem, and they would frame it like, you have to do this, you know, and it's completely destroying the relationship. It's saying that you have to do this, or I don't like you, or I'm not going to work with you. It's setting the person up to fail. If they don't do it, you're not going to call, or they're not going to call you, I mean. So really trying to avoid those kinds of prescriptive requirements. And then preserving choice. So passing the push-away test is an important one. I worked with a 14-year-old who really didn't have any support network, and he was in JTDC and had all these things going on. And every time I visited him in the juvenile temporary detention center, well, not every time, but like every other time, he would fire me. You know, he'd be like, there's no point in this for sure in the future. You know, don't bother, don't come back. And I'd say, okay, well, I have to come back one more time, and then if you don't want me to come back, we can talk about that. Which was totally arbitrary. I just didn't know what to say to him. But now I've actually built that into my practice. So I'm working with an 18-year-old student right now who yesterday decided she doesn't want to do any of the legal sort of strategy that we had come up with, and is ready to just end representation. And I said, okay, well, the policy is that you have to wait a week, and then if you still feel that way, you can call me in a week, and that will be the decision. So building in these moments where they can still come back, because I think Amanda mentioned, like, one of the prevalent symptoms of having a trauma history is looking for confirmation that things are going to go wrong, or that things are going to go the way they did before, or that the people around you are going to fail you. And so sometimes when clients are pushing us away, it's really a test to see if we are what they think we are. And so giving them a moment to let that pass can be really useful.
And then being collaborative is the next really big piece to your trauma practice or trauma-informed practice. So asking, we talked about this a lot already, asking open-ended questions and allowing the client the space and time to think through those questions and to answer in their perspective and from their story. So again, sometimes this takes a lot more time. So in intakes, sometimes I will be trying to ask very specific questions, and because you know it's what we got to get into our intake document. But it's taking a step back and saying, why are you here today? Like, what services or what are you looking for help with? And then letting them go. And sometimes it will go on a really long tangent that at the end of the day is entirely irrelevant to your to whatever that you're going to help them with. But the fact that they were able to provide that to you gives them a feeling of safety, building that trust with you again. Oftentimes it'll probably be the first time that they have been able to share their story in that way. So it can go really long. So it might seem like it takes up a lot of extra time, but it can go a very long way to ultimately having a much better outcome with the client rather than them being another lost contact client that you're closing. And like Sarah said, providing choice even with the small things. So like I always love what she does with the previewing on the phone call and allowing the client to pick what thing do you want to discuss first. A part of our practice is we're also in the community and at our healthcare setting partner site. So I always give my clients the choice of, okay, so we need to meet. Would you rather have this conversation on the phone, or would you rather meet in person? If you'd rather meet in person, then are you available on this day when I'm normally there? Oh no, you have therapy on a day I'm not there. That's okay. I will make sure I can fit that into my schedules to allow them to make that choice and what they feel most comfortable with. And then always remembering to frame your representation as a partnership. I think this is really hard to do as lawyers. We forget that it is a partnership sometimes, or at least I do. And so being able to remind them that, this isn't, you're not here so I can tell you what to do or what's the best outcome for you. Like, we're here together to figure that out. And sometimes they will still say whatever you think is best. And so you will say, so I will then respond with saying, well, I think this is best, we could still do this. And if they still say, well, whatever you think, then, you can help make that choice. But for a lot, it really goes a long way into helping them communicate with you regularly, be engaged in the representation, thinking about how they want their case to play out. Acknowledging their perspective is also really important, while also guiding them to the presenting legal issue. So when they're on those, like, for example, I've had these intakes, like I said, where they've gone on tangents, and being able to guide them back, like, I understand, like, I'm so sorry you experienced that. So, if you came in here and said you wanted to get information on guardianship planning, so, here's how we can talk about that, kind of trying to guide them into so you can actually provide the services that you're there to provide. And then looking to alternative sources to narrow down the legal facts can also be really important. We're very fortunate in how our practice is set up, that we partner with clinicians. So a lot of times, if I'm just not able to get the information, the actual legal fact I need to be able to decide, well, am I gonna go storming CPS, or are we gonna wait? Then, being able to, and if I couldn't get that answer, being able to go to their other people that they're working with in their lives to kind of figure that out as well.
So finally, empowerment. So finding things to compliment about your client. Yesterday I had a client, or this morning I had a client cancel on me, and my response to her was, I'm so glad you told me, that was awesome. Right? Like, that's not a huge part of your practice, but that kind of response can make a big deal in encouraging your clients to continue with good behavior. Also recognizing client wins, even if it's not like the point of the representation, can go a long way to helping people recognize that they have strengths and that they can draw on them in the future. Another question we always say in trauma is, how did you do so well in the face of so many challenges? And this is something that is a great conversation to have, like, when you're signing a retainer or when you're deciding to engage in representation, because that's also going to be information for you to draw on when things do get tough with some of your clients. Empowering the client for future encounters. So when I go to a special education meeting with a family, I'm talking them through it, like, when you do this next time, throughout the representation. And then providing tools for success. So a lot of my clients don't have things. They don't have folders, they don't have notebooks, they don't have the things that they need in order to get through representation or to handle stuff on their own going forward. So our initial retainer packet is a folder with a notebook and a pen and my card, and that's where we put all the copies of their retainer and things like that, so that they have somewhere to store things. Okay, so organizational resistance to vicarious trauma or empathic distress. We talked about adjusting systems. So one of the legal aid agencies in Chicago was getting a lot of really difficult, emotionally difficult cases, and one of their solutions was to put 2 attorneys on each case. One attorney was entirely client-facing, and the other attorney was responsible for all the brief writing and deadlines and things like that. That may not work in every organization, but the point is, like, to think about creative ways to handle things in a way that's going to be sustainable for staff. Setting boundaries, some of these things we've talked about, and we're a little bit out of time, so I'm going to hustle up. Take your vacation days, disconnect from email, right? These are things that you know. Like, people say these things to you all the time. Do you actually do them? I've been saying them and not doing them, and it's a problem. So think about where you can actually change your day. And then I think important for supervisory relationships is a good place to address burnout. So I supervise someone, and every time we check in, it's a real check-in. I'm asking, are you okay? How are you doing? Is this caseload manageable for you? I think sometimes that can get lost, and so making it a regular practice. Modeling good self-care, so don't send that email at midnight. Put it in your drafts and make the beginning of your day when you send all the emails that you wrote after hours. I think in legal aid we can especially kind of glorify unhealthy workloads. This is a cultural thing, right? And so we have to, especially those of you who are leaders in the room, that's something to think about. How do you talk about your workload in front of other people? And then for supervisees, talking about your long-term career goals with your supervisor so that you're clear, like, I don't want to burn out in 2 years. I would like to be doing this as a career. I'd like to still be here in 30 years. And then setting boundaries. This is a good conversation in an initial conversation with your supervisor. If I need to say no, or if I have too much on my plate, exactly how am I supposed to say that is a good conversation. And then, of course, suspending intake or talking about caseload is important. Methods for self-care. So one of the things I found was really helpful was de-traumatizing with a similar demographic. So I work with kids with chronic illness, and for a while I was substitute teaching ballet, and those kids, I'm sure, also have traumatic experiences in their history, but all we were doing was plies and pointing our feet, and we were not talking about those things. And it was really important for me to remember that every kid isn't sick, or every kid isn't struggling with a disability. I still, every time my friends get pregnant, I'm like, oh my God, how can you do that? Because I work with so many sick babies. And that's a good demonstration of my brain changing because of this work, and that I need to take steps to make sure that I have a healthier outlook. Meditation, exercise, therapy, nutrition, all of these things that we talked about sort of earlier in the presentation, but we know all these things, and then it becomes, are you doing them? But also, are you nurturing yourself? And that's sort of the final thing to leave you with is, this doesn't mean that as an A+ lawyer, you should be fitting in meditation, exercise, therapy, nutrition, and sleep into every single day. It means that you should be taking care of yourself, right? So thinking about what's going to be restorative for you, and remembering that all of this is rooted in the fact that as humans we are relational. So really grooming the relationships in your life to make sure that you have the support to do the work. We'd love to open it up for questions if that's okay. Also, if you have to go, thank you so much for coming. Thanks a lot.